Welcome back to English Podcast Go. I'm Cyrus, and each episode brings you closer to confident English. Let's jump into today's episode.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've dived into a stack of sources here, grappling with a massive question, one you've probably thought about. Who actually runs the world? If you're like me, maybe a bit older, you might remember a time when the answer felt simpler. The clear bipolar world, U.S. versus the Soviets. Two big poles setting the rules. Or maybe you really only know the unipolar world after the Soviet Union collapsed. The U.S. as the sole superpower, kind of dominant everywhere, projecting power globally. But then our sources point out something shifted pretty dramatically, maybe 15 years ago or so. The U.S. started pulling back a bit.
Yeah, less willing to be the world's policeman or architect.
Right. And other nations grew stronger, got more assertive, sometimes ignoring rules, sometimes even rewriting rules they just didn't like.
And the result, what this material we're looking at calls a leaderless world.
A leaderless world. Okay.
And what's truly fascinating from the sources is how they kind of boil down all the chaos of this leaderless time to just three core drivers. They suggest these three things are behind over 90% of the geopolitical tension we see right now.
90%?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, what are they?
Well, first, they identify Russia. The source argues Russia was never really truly integrated into Western institutions after the Cold War. It's portrayed as, a declining former great power, understandably kind of angry about its diminished status. The source doesn't really take sides on whose fault that is.
Just states it as a fact, driving things.
Exactly. Just says it's a fundamental reality driving their actions now.
Okay, so Russia feels left out, reacting from perceived decline. What's number two the sources highlight?
The second one is China. Now, China was integrated into the U.S.-led global system, right? But the sources reveal the thinking behind that integration was maybe fundamentally flawed.
Flawed how?
Well, the thinking, especially in the U.S., was that as China got richer and more powerful, they would essentially become Americans, adopt Western political norms, values.
I'm guessing that didn't quite happen.
Exactly. The sources are pretty clear. They're still Chinese. And China, operating within the global system as China, with its own distinct political and economic model, well, that makes the United States increasingly uncomfortable. It creates friction.
Okay, so you've got Russia feeling excluded and angry, China integrated but not conforming like expected. What's the third part of this leaderless puzzle?
This one, it hits closer to home for a lot of people, certainly in the U.S. and other wealthy democracies. The sources say tens of millions of citizens within these countries felt profoundly left behind by globalization over decades.
Left behind?
Yeah, and their concerns were largely ignored, by the political establishment, by the elites.
And the result of that long-term neglect?
Right.
What do the sources say?
The sources argue the consequence is that these citizens now see their own governments, their own leaders, as lacking legitimacy.
So internal instability.
Right. This internal instability within powerful nations weakens their ability to lead on the world stage and just adds another layer to this whole leaderless picture.
Wow. So looking at almost any major international flashpoint today, the source material suggests you can trace the roots back to one or more of those three things: a resentful Russia, a non-conforming China, and disillusioned populations in established democracies.
That's the argument they make, yeah. Pretty compelling when you lay it out.
Okay, so that gives us a clear picture of the recent past this leaderless phase, but the material we've looked at suggests this isn't going to last forever.
Yeah.
So the mission for this deep dive is to really dig into what the sources predict is coming next. And it's not just another simple bipolar or unipolar system, or even a standard multipolar one. Instead, the sources anticipate something different: the emergence of three distinct, overlapping global orders within the next 10 years. Let's dive into what those look like.
Right. Let's start with the first order the sources describe, the global security order. According to the analysis we've seen, this is the one area where power remains, undeniably unipolar. And it's likely to stay that way for the next decade or so.
And that unipolar power is centered where? Still the U.S.
The United States and its core allies, yeah. The source makes a really strong case that the U.S. is still the only nation that can project significant military power and influence into every region of the globe all at the same time.
Okay, even with China's rise.
Well, China's military is definitely modernizing fast, expanding its reach, but the sources note its capacity is still primarily focused really on the Asia-Pacific. And kind of ironically, this growth sometimes makes its neighbors more reliant on the U.S. security umbrella for balance.
That makes sense. And what about Europe? We've seen the situation with Ukraine, obviously.
Exactly. The source highlights how events like the invasion of Ukraine have actually reinforced U.S. security leadership in Europe. NATO allies have become more concerned.
And therefore more dependent.
More dependent on the U.S. and a U.S.-led alliance structure, yes. And Russia's military capabilities, while still significant, are assessed by the source as considerably weakened, by losses in Ukraine and the difficulty sanctions create for rebuilding key military stuff.
So even with other countries having nuclear weapons, the sources suggest that doesn't fundamentally shift this security picture.
Correct. I mean, the sources point out that while nukes are a terrifying risk, their use still implies mutual annihilation, which, thankfully, is a powerful deterrent. So in terms of conventional power projection, alliance leadership, the global security order is and looks set to remain unipolar around the U.S.
Okay, so security is unipolar, U.S.-led, but then the sources immediately pivot to a second global order that looks completely different, the economic one.
Absolutely. The material really emphasizes that the global economic order is fundamentally multipolar. Power is shared. It's spread out among multiple major players. While the U.S. economy is still huge, resilient, the source says it just cannot use its military dominance anymore to dictate economic terms to everyone else.
And is that partly because everything's so interconnected now? Especially with
And
China.
Precisely. The sources really underscore the enormous economic interdependence between the U.S. and China. They describe it as a relationship where neither side can truly, control the other economically. The analysis even notes, maybe surprisingly, that overall trade between the U.S. and China is reportedly at historically high levels, despite all the geopolitical tension.
Huh. That raises a fascinating point the sources seem to grapple with. How exactly do you conduct something like a Cold War when your two biggest players are so deeply tangled up commercially?
It's a core tension, yeah. And the sources highlight that it prevents a clean break, a full decoupling. And beyond the U.S. and China, the sources identify other really critical players in this multipolar economic world. The European Union, for instance.
Right, the huge common market.
Exactly. World's largest common market. And its regulatory power, the Brussels effect, means if you want to do profitable global business, you often have to play by their rules. Then there's India, playing an increasingly significant role.
And Japan, still a major force.
Japan remains a major influential economy, definitely.
So even as their relative strengths might kind of shift around a bit over the next decade, the basic structure of the global economic order stays multipolar, shared among these big players.
That's the source's assessment, yes. That's the picture they paint.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because the sources point out the inherent tensions between these two orders, the unipolar security one and the multipolar economic one. They don't always align.
No, they don't. They describe a dynamic where the United States will naturally try to leverage its national security power to pull more economies into its orbit, particularly in sensitive areas.
We're seeing that already, aren't we? With tech like semiconductors, critical minerals, maybe even the whole debate around TikTok.
Exactly. The sources see that as a clear example of the U.S. using security concerns to shape economic alignments. But then, on the flip side, China is trying to use its growing commercial power, its economic leverage,
To gain diplomatic alignment.
influence around the world.
Precisely. Using economic ties to build political influence. And where do the other major powers fit into this push and pull? Like Europe, Japan, India.
Well, the sources say they aren't just sitting back and watching. They are actively trying to balance between these two forces. They're working to make sure that neither the U.S.-led security order nor the China-influenced economic order completely dominates the other.
And the sources think they'll succeed in maintaining that balance.
The analysis suggests they will largely succeed, yes. They'll carve out space between the two giants.
Okay, so we have a unipolar security order, a multipolar economic order, often pulling in different directions. But the sources say there's a third order emerging, maybe even more important. And critically, it's not primarily run by governments.
This is the digital order, and it's increasingly shaped, even controlled by technology companies. What the sources lay out here is, frankly, a staggering picture of power. Power that's already in place, often operating outside or, beyond the traditional reach of nation-states.
How do the sources illustrate that power? Give us an example.
Well, look at Ukraine again. We all know about the military aid, the financial aid from governments, right? But the sources argue powerfully that it was technology companies that provided the vital tools for cyber defense. They kept communications online for leaders, for the military. They allowed President Zelensky to address the world constantly.
So without the tech companies.
The analysis suggests that without that tech infrastructure and support, Ukraine could have been cyber dark, functionally offline within weeks. That would have profoundly changed the outcome.
That's a very concrete example of power in a conflict zone.
Sure.
But the sources also point to this power shaping things within democracies, too.
Oh, absolutely. The sources highlight how tech companies, through their platforms, effectively decide if a political figure can bypass traditional media and speak directly to hundreds of millions of people. They discuss how the amplification mechanisms on social media, especially spreading disinformation, conspiracy theories, how that's directly linked in the sources to real-world political instability.
Like January 6th.
From the January 6th events at the U.S. Capitol to, trucker protests, insurrections elsewhere, the platforms play a key role, according to the analysis.
And on a really personal level, the sources make a compelling argument about the digital order's impact on our identity, who we are.
Yeah, they pose this idea that increasingly who we are is shaped not just by nature or nurture, but by the algorithm.
By the algorithm.
Yeah. If you want to challenge the system or dominant narratives today, the sources suggest you don't just question traditional authority or institutions anymore. You have to question the algorithm itself. That represents a concentration of influence, of power, that feels almost unprecedented. And it's in the hands of a relatively small number of companies and their leaders.
The sources sort of speculate on different ways this digital order might go, right? Maybe a tech Cold War, companies aligning with nations.
Or maybe a new kind of globalized competition just among the tech giants themselves. Or even a scenario where tech companies become the dominant global actors as government power kind of erodes.
But whichever way it goes.
Regardless of the specific path, the sources are crystal clear on one thing. There is no pause button. These technologies, they're developing and disrupting things incredibly rapidly.
So what does this deep dive into the sources ultimately suggest for the near future? It's not one simple global order we're heading towards.
No, not at all.
But potentially three overlapping ones. A unipolar security order, still led by the U.S., a multipolar economic order, where power is shared among major economies like the U.S., China, EU, India, Japan. And then this third one, the rapidly growing, profoundly important digital order run mostly by technology companies.
And as you noted, the sources identify that inherent tension, particularly between the governmental security and economic realms. The U.S. using military leverage for economic alignment, China using commercial leverage for diplomatic alignment.
And everyone else trying to balance in between.
Exactly. Others trying to maintain that balance.
But the material consistently circles back to that third order, the digital one. Yeah. Run by tech companies, emphasizing its increasing importance, its unique power we saw in Ukraine, enabling defense, communication. We see it shaping political discourse, sometimes fueling instability, even influencing personal identity through algorithms. That idea that challenging the system now means questioning the algorithm. That's a perspective from the sources that really sticks with you.
It really does. And the sources directly underscore the immense power now concentrated with these tech companies and their key leaders, describing them as becoming some of the most powerful individuals on the planet. And the sources don't shy away from raising some pretty critical questions for these leaders.
They really press the point, don't they? There's no stopping the tech advance. The sources specifically highlight concerns like how will tech leaders act accountably, especially with powerful new AI coming online.
Right. And what will they do with the unprecedented amounts of data they collect and control? That's a huge one.
And the concern the sources seem to think is maybe the most urgent right now. Will they keep relying on advertising models that make massive revenue by essentially turning citizens into products?
Models that, according to the sources, are directly contributing to the spread of hate, misinformation, actively tearing apart the fabric of societies.
Yeah. So here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider, straight from the source material we've been discussing. The sources observe that the U.S. was once seen as the principal exporter of democracy.
Albeit sometimes hypocritically, as they note.
Right, fair point. But today, the same sources suggest the U.S. has become the principal exporter of tools that actually destroy democracy, tools created and controlled by these incredibly powerful tech leaders.
So the question the sources leave us with is, are these tech leaders okay with that outcome? Is that the legacy they want? And critically, what, if anything, are they going to choose to do about it?
That's definitely a question for you to think about.